near the end of the previous administration, the then Treasury Minister, said there was just no time to do it and it wasn't going to be progressed.
I think he even said he would leave it to the next administration. So we put it in, we rolled over that commitment and put it in as an action plan inside the government's programme. Scheduled it initially for October 2017, but because of other priorities, didn't get to it till I got to it lots of times, but each time I started it, it came up against a lack of political consensus, or the officers thought that they couldn't work on this relative to other priorities. So I've eventually managed to make that statement, and we confirmed a couple of things that were going on and made a couple of announcements. And I really do hope now that we've got probably 4 strands of activity that will lead to something worthwhile, so that people see a difference by the end of this administration. But let's see, I hope so, and I'm going to do everything I can about it, because I'm sincere, as is the Council of Ministers, as are my Tynwald colleagues, that we have to find a political consensus, because the current system is unfair.
The sewage charge came out 4 years ago now, and even at that point it was known that it was going to be transformed into a rate. So even in the last administration, the sewerage rate was an issue in relation to rateable values.
Well, no, when the sewerage charge was first introduced, it was exactly that. It was a fixed amount for all people, and then there was a controversy. I took in a petition of 6,500 people, and eventually the compromise was it became a rate which increased quite markedly, and that's been noticed by people outside. We've had a water rate for a great number of decades, but whereas traditionally the issue was seen as a local authority issue, it became seen in the last 4 or 5 years as not only a local authority issue, because now much more than half of the amount of money collected from rateable values isn't for local authorities and burial authorities, it's for the Manx Utilities Authority for water and sewerage. So therefore, what I've said is that as government has written off £95 million of the Manx Utilities debt, part of the price for that was coming up with a new pricing strategy for water and sewerage. And what I've done is I've said solving the rates issue is no longer just a local authority issue, it's also solving the water and sewerage charging issue. So Manx Utilities has commissioned independent consultants who will help them come to the Council of Ministers to take to Tynwald in October a report on the new pricing strategy, and it will have to revisit that 5-year experience of sewerage rates that you've just described, sewerage charges before that, and it will have to persuade government first, then Tynwald, and at the same time the Manx public, that it's got a fair process for charging. It's not simple. Water meters historically have seemed to not make a lot of sense in the Isle of Man, but they're politically very attractive, it seems. The reason they don't make sense is because we've got a lot of water in the Isle of Man, because it rains quite a lot, and there's a lot of capital infrastructure that's got to be charged for somehow. So that's all on the table, single person discounts to do with water and sewerage, and I've passed that over to work with Manx Utilities. A second thing that I confirmed was that we have inside our legislation programme a rating and valuation bill, and I've taken personal responsibility with the people around me to make sure that we have drafting instructions for that, so that we can do things like single person discounts, but also look at the prompt payment discounts, also look at linking it into means testing with data sharing. So they're 2 tidying up things that have been around for some time that were already in the programme, and then there are a couple of new dimensions. Just
going back to the decision to actually progress it at this stage, are you essentially saying that it wasn't a priority for government when it was a local authority issue, even though it was seen as an inequitable system, until it became a government issue when the sewerage and water rates made up half of the rates that were brought in?
Perhaps that's what it sounded like, but what I actually meant was there are only actual fact, people don't believe this, but in terms of policy making and being able to support politicians, there are very few people who are in the sort of central hub there making policy, and the sort of people who could work with me to help it in the last 18 months have been looking at things like the Sea Services Agreement and gas regulation and money val and substance requirements for the EU, and looking at the SAVE programme and looking at a new way of budgeting. And it's only now that we're being able to move those around to the very difficult issue politically of changing rates, because there's a town versus country aspect to it. There's a user paying for use versus paying for the size of your house versus how many people you have living in the house aspect. There's all sorts of complexities to it. So they're the sort of priorities. Ultimately, we get by with rates. It's unfair. If something went wrong with substance or our steam packet or our money val reputation, that would be much more serious than the unfairness that's in the rate system from the total population point of view. So it's prioritisation in that sense, and rates didn't quite hack it till now, but they've got a big focus for the next 6 months and to have a deliverable thing so that things are fair, at least fairer by 2021.
Now, you say that this hasn't been tackled up to this point because it's a difficult project to get through. It's complicated, and politically it'd be difficult to actually pass and to bring in. If you're broadening out the scope of it, aren't you changing it from something that's difficult to something that's potentially impossible? There's
an officer at work who's very witty like this, and he brought me in recently the 1967 report that his predecessors had worked on, which he said probably had very similar solutions to the ones that we've come up with now, and it had been impossible for them to be implemented ever since then, so why would we succeed? No, you make a good point, but I think actually by broadening it out slightly we make the solution more likely rather than less likely, because a while back, to do a revaluation, people started thinking initially of surveyors. We've changed the mindset. We're starting to look to use data that we already have from the census, from other databases, from the government's property database, which is called the Gazetteer informally, from all sorts of places. We need to have the consent to use it. We need to make sure that it's compliant with law. We need to have the IT systems. We need to have the agreement between staff to work together to achieve this. But I actually think that by broadening it out and by thinking about solving it in modern ways, we can have a good stab at making things fairer for everybody.
Now, when you say you want to broaden out the scope to include non-domestic property rating, what is classed as non-domestic? I mean, what type of property are we talking about here?
Well, business rates. So 30 years ago across, they moved over to a uniform business rate, which is something that I hinted at as being something that we needed to explore. Is it right that certain local authorities have a much greater proportion of their income from businesses because of the businesses that are there than others? So typically, I think it's quite widely known, places like Braddon and Bride and perhaps to an extent Maloo have more than the Isle of Man average in terms of percentage of business rates. Some other of the towns have quite a lot less. Perhaps obviously there are costs that have been associated with both in the past and in the future. So for instance, I can think of a new community facility, sports hall type place in a relatively business rich part of the island. That they want some sort of assurance that if we do any changes, they'll be over a number of years so that a transition can be put in place. And that's why I floated with colleagues the idea of national community-based projects. I don't know what exactly we could fund. We could perhaps fund regional swimming pools. We could perhaps fund activities like I just described in terms of other leisure facilities. There was talk of an all-island leisure rate 4 or 5 years ago. Perhaps we could look at regeneration projects. Perhaps we could look at things like libraries, which are fulfilling a national need on a local basis. We don't exactly know what we're doing, because what we're doing first is we're launching a consultation to discuss with all those affected. But it certainly seems to me to be a good idea to explore the idea that there's a part of the money that's collected locally that's actually for national purposes that would then need to be divided up again to fulfil national needs with community-based activity.
That could mean that people in certain areas, Bride as an example, could be hit twice by increases in rates, in that when the domestic property revaluation takes place, likelihood communities like Bride will face a rate increase, but they'll also have to subsidise that money that's no longer coming from business rates.
They could, but that's exactly the issue that we need to explore in this sort of project. And I can absolutely assure people that that there'll be a transition in place, and you can't say that if you're benefiting from an unfair system, you can always continue benefiting from it if you're going to say that you're making the system fairer. But there are some sort of anomalies that people don't even completely realise that exist as yet. For instance, so to my surprise, when I saw all the data, the top 4 local authorities all roughly pay the same average rate. Douglas has a higher rate, but the rateable value in Douglas is actually a bit lower because of the size of houses and some of the other places around the island. So there is more. When you look at the data, you can break it down into about 4, if perhaps 5 groups of organisations. At one end you've got ones that are definitely having a bit of a laugh at the expense perhaps of some of the others, and at the top end probably unfairly charged. But Tim Baker made this point very clearly in the rate statement by his question. It's not only about the rate charged, it's also about the quality and the access and the amount of the service that's delivered as well. And I responded to him saying, yes, you made a good point, Tim, but it's also about the cost of delivering the service. It does cost more to go and pick up bins up the end of a farm lane than it does to just walk next door inside a Douglas Street and take the bin from your next door neighbour. These are all very complicated issues. It's going to take lots of people to work on them, to solve them. It's going to involve local authorities. Let's have a go. Got 2 or 3 years, and I hope with the infrastructure department we can tackle even those sorts of issues.
Well, the non-domestic rates, do they include agricultural rates?
So, you're getting into the real, just as you always do, Catherine, we're getting into some pretty controversial areas, but principles have in the past have been about capital values. That's a big worry. We haven't answered that sort of question. By definition, I said it was all non-domestic rates, so my starting point is yes, but we haven't actually completely finalised the scope of the consultation, and when you consult, that doesn't actually mean that you're going to do something. But charities, agricultural, all these things need tidying up after 50 years.
Can you ever create a system which is seen as fair by all?
No. And there are all different types of things for which there can be unfairness, and there are different elements of receipt and of payment for all those different things. So no, you can never have a completely fair system. Again, Tim Baker made the point: being fair is not about being equal. It's about just encouraging understanding of the differences and accepting them as widely as you can, that they're fair differences.